You're listening to the Valley Current.
You know, I want you to imagine for a second that you're making this massive, totally life-altering decision. Like, say you're buying a house, a big, sprawling, beautiful estate.
Right. A huge investment. High stakes.
Exactly. The stakes are incredibly high. So naturally, you hire a structural engineer to come out and inspect the place. And there's this underlying expectation, right? You expect precision. You want a simple binary answer. Is the foundation solid or is it, compromised?
Because you're not looking for poetry here. You just want the cold, hard, physical reality of the structure.
Yeah, totally. Broken or not broken, safe or unsafe. It's supposed to be clean. But imagine the engineer finishes the inspection, walks out, and hands you this detailed, highly technical report. And it shows that the house is currently sitting over a massive, expanding sinkhole.
Oh, wow. So it's structurally doomed.
Completely doomed.
Yeah.
But then you turn on the television, and the seller of the house is on national news. They're looking right into the camera, smiling, and saying, hey, don't worry about the rumors. The foundation is perfect. It just needs a fresh coat of paint. In that exact moment, you have a very serious problem. And it's not just a problem with the house. It's a problem with the fundamental reality you're being asked to accept.
Yeah, it creates the ultimate cognitive dissonance. I mean, which source of information do you actually trust when the narratives are that wildly far apart?
Exactly.
Do you trust the engineer with the ground-penetrating radar? Or, the person with a massive vested interest in making the sale?
And that tension right there, that terrifying cavernous gap between what the experts are actually measuring on the ground and what the leadership is telling the public, that is the absolute core of what we're looking at today.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. I am so incredibly glad you're joining us because today's mission is, well, it's a heavy one.
It really is.
But it's absolutely critical if you want to understand what's actually happening in the world right now, beneath all the headlines and the noise. Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
We're looking at a highly sensitive, incredibly dense geopolitical and decision theory briefing.
Yeah, and it's from Computer Law Group LLP, or CLG. Right. And the document itself is dated May 7th and 8th, 2026.
And just to set the stage for you, regarding how significant this document is, this isn't just an opinion piece. It's not some op-ed. It is a rigorous, data-driven synthesis of a rapidly developing, ongoing conflict between the United States and Iran.
And it focuses on a specific concept, right?
Yeah, it focuses on something the analysts are calling the outlast doctrine.
And before we get totally lost in the weeds of naval deployments and intelligence leaks, I want to make something crystal clear to you, the listener. Our goal here today is strictly impartial. We're not here to take a political side, left, right, or center.
Like no endorsements.
Exactly. We aren't endorsing the administration, and we certainly aren't endorsing an adversarial regime. We're simply taking this leaked intelligence assessment, the statistical models it contains, and the factual claims presented in our source material, and we're stripping away all the political theater.
We just want to understand the actual structural realities of this standoff.
What's fascinating here is that the CLG briefing frames this entire massive geopolitical crisis around one central, unavoidable question.
Right, which is if you have a standoff between a U.S. administration that's fighting against a hard, ticking electoral clock and an entrenched revolutionary regime that literally measures its strategies in decades, who actually has the most patience?
Who outlasts whom? That's the core of it. And as we go through this, I really want you to think about your own life, your own workplace. Think about how you make decisions when you suddenly stop trusting your usual sources of information.
It completely changes your calculus.
It does. Just keep that in the back of your mind, because it's going to be incredibly important when we talk about this psychological and institutional concept called the lambda inversion a little later on. But to even understand how we get to that inversion, we have to start with the spark that lit this specific fire.
We have to look at what happened on the morning of May 7th, which was a seismic event in Washington. It wasn't just a rumor. It was a highly coordinated, undeniable breach of the executive branch's internal reality.
We're talking about a Washington Post exclusive. It dropped on their website on May 7th at exactly 11:19 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time.
By Warren Strobel, John Hudson, and Ellen Nakashima.
Yeah, that's the byline. And what they revealed to the entire world was the contents of a highly confidential CIA assessment. And this assessment had been recently delivered directly to the White House.
And The conclusions of that CIA assessment are incredibly stark. They represent the consensus view of the intelligence community. The CIA formally concluded that the Iranian regime is fully capable of surviving the current, punishing U.S. naval blockade for at least 90 to 120 days.
Which is a huge window.
It is. But it wasn't just a broad economic assessment, he was deeply tactical. The assessment detailed the precise state of Iran's surviving military hardware.
And this is the part of the source material that genuinely made my jaw drop. I mean, we've all seen the news about the ongoing strikes, the constant pressure campaign. You'd think the adversary's military would just be in absolute ruins by now.
You would think so, yeah.
But the CIA found that Iran still retains roughly 75% of its pre-war mobile missile launchers.
75%.
Let me repeat that for everyone. 3/4 of their mobile launch capability is still perfectly intact. They still possess 70% of their pre-war missile inventory. And as if that wasn't alarming enough for the Pentagon, the assessment explicitly states that Iran has reopened, quote, almost all of its underground storage facilities.
Now, if you look at those numbers in a complete vacuum, they are concerning for any military planner.
Oh, absolutely.
That they don't exist in a vacuum. They exist in direct, highly public contradiction to what the commander-in-chief was saying literally the day before.
This is the reality gap. This is the sinkhole under the house we were talking about. On May 6th, just 24 hours before this leak hits the Washington Post, the U.S. president is sitting in the Oval Office. He's speaking on the record to the public.
Right.
And he claims with absolute confidence that Iranian missiles are mostly decimated. He literally used specific numbers, telling the American people that Iran's capabilities were reduced down to, quote, probably 19%.
I really want to pause on that because the scale of that contradiction is historically massive.
It's wild.
You had the executive branch's premier intelligence agency telling the principal decision maker that the adversary has 70 to 75% of their offensive capability fueled, loaded, and ready to go.
Yeah.
And you have the head of that very same executive branch telling the global public that the adversary is down to 18 or 19%. That is a reality gap so wide, you could navigate an entire carrier strike group through it.
And the world isn't blind, right? The global markets, the allies, and most importantly, the adversary, they all see this gap. And the kinetic fallout from this leak, from this sudden, glaring exposure of Washington's internal dysfunction, was virtually instantaneous.
The timeline here is just wild.
Yeah. The Washington Post article goes live at 11:19 a.m. within 7 hours. The tactical situation halfway across the globe rapidly deteriorates.
It was a direct, localized escalation. 3 U.S.-guided missile destroyers operating near the Strait of Hormuz, the USS Trustin, the USS Rafael Peralta, and the USS Mason found themselves engaged.
And it wasn't just a minor skirmish, or a warning shot across the bow. The U.S. forces launched major retaliatory strikes against a whole host of Iranian coastal targets. The briefing list strikes on Bandar Kargan, Kishim, Bandar Kamir, Sirik, and Bandar Abbas.
That is a massive application of localized force.
Exactly. In one of the most economically sensitive maritime choke points on planet Earth, this is serious, heavily armed escalation. And yet, how did the president characterize these specific strikes when he spoke to ABC's Rachel Scott shortly after?
He looked into the camera and called the entire engagement just a love tap.
Just a love tap?
Yeah.
We have destroyers launching coordinated strikes against coastal military infrastructure, and it's being downplayed as a love tap. It brings us right back to the house on the sinkhole. It's like getting a structural engineer's report that the ground beneath you is literally collapsing, and you're standing on the porch telling everyone it's just a minor settling issue.
Exactly.
I have to push back here, though, because political spin is as old as politics itself. Presidents downplay conflicts all the time to manage public panic, right? Why is this specific gap, this love tap comment, paired with the CIA leak, treated by the CLG analysts as such a catastrophic structural failure?
Because it's not just public relations. It's about the mechanics of global deterrence.
Okay, how so?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, deterrence relies entirely on the adversary, believing that your actions are rational, that they're calculated, and based on a shared understanding of physical reality.
Right.
When the gap between your intelligence community's assessment and the principal decision-maker's public posture becomes this wide, the entire system of deterrence begins to fracture. Iran is watching this unfold.
They see everything.
Exactly. They aren't just reacting to the fact that 3 U.S. destroyers are sitting in the strait. They're reacting to the terrifying incoherence of the decision-making apparatus in Washington. If they believe the U.S. president is operating on a fundamentally false premise, that he actually thinks they are down to 18% capability, they might calculate that the U.S. will miscalculate. And that is when wars spiral out of control.
Because you can't rationally negotiate with someone who doesn't agree with you on the basic laws of gravity in the room.
No, you can't.
And the CLG briefing makes a crucial point here. A discrepancy of this magnitude doesn't just happen by accident. You don't just misplace 50% of an adversary's missile stockpile in a filing cabinet.
Right.
This happens because of how the decision maker is actively filtering the information that reaches their desk, which brings us to the theoretical framework that makes this whole briefing so fascinating. The analysts use a concept called the lambda inversion, and they tie it to an incredibly aggressive institutional purge.
This is where the political science merges with pure decision theory. The CLG analysts base their framework on a very recent, highly regarded paper published in 2026 in the journal Risk Analysis.
By Shimura Nguyen and Bierman.
Yes. And what they built is a mathematical framework for understanding how leaders make choices in environments characterized by extreme risk and ambiguity. And the absolute load-bearing pillar of their entire model is a Greek letter, lambda.
Okay, for everyone listening who hasn't taken a graduate-level statistics or decision theory class recently, let's really break this down. In the real world, sitting at the Resolute desk, what exactly is lambda?
So in this mathematical model, lambda represents the weight or the specific value that a decision maker assigns to a given piece of information or a given signal. It exists on a very simple scale from 0 to 1.
0 to 1. So total rejection to total acceptance.
Precisely. If the president looks at an intelligence report and assigns it a lambda of basically 0, it means that information is completely, utterly dismissed. It doesn't factor into the mental math at all.
Wow.
But if they assign a lambda approaching 1, it means they adopt that signal wholesale. They treat it as absolute gospel. But here is the critical nuance that Sver and his colleagues point out. What governs a leader's lambda isn't just a generalized sense of truth. It is heavily dependent on source-specific credibility.
Meaning, the president isn't asking, is this fact true? He's asking, do I trust the specific person who just handed me this piece of paper?
Exactly. And the risk analysis paper outlines an incredibly dangerous institutional phenomenon. They call it the lambda inversion.
Which is?
It happens when a principal leader artificially lowers the lambda when they actively assign a 0 weight to the highest information sources within their own system. When they do that, their perspective collapses inward.
Because they've blocked out the experts.
Right, because they have silenced the experts, they have to fill the void, so they start relying entirely on lower information sources, or purely ideological sources that remain in their inner circle. They make systematically biased, catastrophic choices without ever realizing they are biased because they've engineered an environment where no one is allowed to correct them.
They literally don't know what they don't know because they've fired everyone capable of measuring the sinkhole. And that is exactly what the CLG briefing argues has happened at the National Security Council and the Pentagon over the last year. They document a sweeping, unprecedented purge of U.S. officials that began back in February of 2025. And when you look at the names on this list, it is staggering. This isn't just a few political appointees resigning.
It's a wholesale, systematic decapitation of institutional memory and top-tier military expertise.
Let's actually walk through the specifics provided in the text because the sheer scale of the brain drain here is wild. We're talking about the removal of General C.Q. Brown, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Lisa Franchetti, the Chief of Naval Operations, General James Slife, the Vice Chief of Staff of the Air Force. They even cleared out the top military lawyers. All 3 Service Judge Advocates General were removed. Admiral Linda Fagan of the Coast Guard, gone in January 2025. Vice Admiral Shoshana Chatfield, pulled from the NATO Military Committee in April 2025. General Timothy Hugh, the head of the NSA and Cyber Command, the guy tasked with monitoring the adversary's digital infrastructure, removed in April 2025.
And that was just the first wave. The attrition didn't plateau, it actually accelerated as the crisis deepened into 2026.
Right. Jump forward to April 2026. Army Chief of Staff General Randy George is suddenly forced into early retirement. He goes out alongside General David Hodney and, incredibly, the Army Chief of Chaplains, Major General William Green Jr.
Even the chaplains.
Yeah. The civilian leadership wasn't immune either. Navy Secretary John Phelan was fired outright on April 22nd, 2026. But honestly, as I was reading the source material, the departure that struck me as the most dramatic, the most telling, was what happened in March 2026 with Joe Kent.
Joe Kent, the director of the National Counterterrorism Center, the NCTC. That is the central hub for synthesizing all threat data coming into the United States.
And he didn't just quietly get fired or politely resign to spend more time with his family. He resigned in fiery protest on March 17th, and he made it incredibly public.
He really did.
He went straight to social media, posting on X that he could not, quote, in good conscience, support the ongoing war in Iran. He didn't mince words. He flat out stated to the world, Iran posed no imminent threat to our nation. And then he took it a step further. He went on Tucker Carlson's show and openly declared that the intelligence community's ability to provide a basic sanity check on executive decisions was, quote, largely stifled in the second iteration.
It is a profound institutional rupture. And the briefing also pulls in another massive piece of evidence, the Director of National Intelligence herself, Tulsi Gabbard.
Oh, right.
The text highlights her sworn testimony to the Senate and House Intelligence Committees all the way back in March of 2025. She sat before Congress and testified under oath that Iran was not actively building a nuclear weapon and that the Supreme Leader had not reauthorized the weaponization program that had been suspended back in 2003.
Which is an incredible data point. Think about the dynamic there. Gabbard is an appointed official by this administration, but even she could not or simply would not suppress the actual ground truth career intelligence assessments coming out of her agencies.
The facts were just too stubborn.
The facts on the ground were simply too clear, too undeniable, even for the political layer to obfuscate. MIT's Caitlin Talmadge analyzed this entire spring purge and called the pattern unprecedented in our nation's history. But as I'm processing all of this, a really obvious question jumps out at me.
What's that?
Well, if I'm an analyst sitting at a desk in Langley, and I know for a fact that the president is placing a lambda of absolute zero on everything my agency produces, if I know he's just systematically firing every general and director who brings some data he doesn't like, why on earth would the CIA even bother generating this highly detailed report about Iran surviving for 90 to 120 days?
That's a great question.
Like, why do the excruciating, dangerous intelligence work if you know with absolute certainty it's just going straight into a shredder at the White House?
It gets to the very heart of how vast bureaucracies survive when their leadership goes rogue. The CLG briefing introduces a brilliant, highly specific term for this exact phenomenon, bureaucratic dissent as credibility injection.
I have to say, bureaucratic dissent as credibility injection is one of those phrases that sounds like dense academic jargon, but it actually feels incredibly visceral. What does that mechanism look like in practice?
It looked like institutional self-preservation. The career intelligence officers, the lifers who actually track the missile movements, they know their internal lambda is zero. They know the president has effectively blocked their phone number.
Right.
So they realize that routing the truth through the Oval Office is mathematically pointless. Instead, they have to route the signal through an external channel, a channel that the president cannot ignore, or at least a channel that forces the rest of the American political system to sit up and pay attention.
They have to go outside the house.
They need to artificially inject credibility into their findings from the outside. And that is exactly why the identity of the specific journalist who broke this leak is not an accident. It is a highly calculated choice.
Warren Strobel.
Exactly. The leakers didn't just hand this highly classified explosive assessment to a random blogger or a junior reporter desperate for a scoop. They gave the exclusive directly to Warren Strobel. If you study the history of American intelligence reporting, you know exactly who Strobel is.
He's a legend.
Back in 2002 and 2003, when he was working for Knight Ridder, he was one of the very, very few reporters in the mainstream media who actually got the Iraq weapons of mass destruction story right.
That is massive context. While all the prestige press, the front pages of the biggest papers in the country were largely buying the administration's narrative that Saddam Hussein had active WMD programs, Strobel and his team were digging deep. They were the ones finding and publishing the dissenting, skeptical views from deep within the intelligence community.
Precisely. He has an unparalleled track record of challenging executive branch narratives with hard career-level intelligence. So every seasoned officer at Langley knows exactly who Strobel is. He is the guy who acts as a conduit for the truth when the government is pushing a false narrative to justify a war.
Wow.
By deliberately sourcing this contradicting CIA assessment to that specific byline, the leakers are making a profound statement. They're consciously selecting a channel that possesses massive institutional memory and unimpeachable repertorial standing.
Right, they're forcing the issue.
They're actively forcing the president's wider reference group, meaning the United States Congress, the broader press corps, and the Article 3 federal courts, to assign this leaked signal a very, very high lambda. Even if the White House stubbornly continues to assign it a 0, the rest of the checks and balances in the American system are suddenly forced by the sheer credibility of the messenger to take it seriously.
That is absolutely fascinating. I'm thinking of it like a medical procedure. It's essentially a bypass surgery for information. The main artery to the brain, the Oval Office, is completely blocked by ideology. So the intelligence community routes the lifeblood of truth around the blockage through the press to keep the rest of the democratic system alive.
That's a perfect analogy. The system finds a way to circulate the oxygen. However, the CLG briefing is not naive about this. It offers a very sobering historical reality check.
Okay, what's the catch?
Well, these leaks, these external credibility injections, they almost never have the power to stop a kinetic war in its tracks immediately. The release of the Pentagon Papers didn't end the Vietnam War the next day. The dissent footnotes published by Knight Ridder in 2002 didn't stop the tanks from rolling into Baghdad.
Right. The bureaucratic inertia of a superpower moving toward conflict is usually too massive to halt overnight. So if it doesn't stop the war, what is the functional purpose? What do these leaks actually accomplish?
What they reliably do, over a multi-month horizon, is severely compress the administration's political bandwidth. They make it exponentially harder for the White House to wring congressional support out of skeptical lawmakers for any further escalation.
Oh, I see.
They raise the domestic political price of sustaining military commitments. And, perhaps most crucially for the long arc of history, they construct an undeniable, paper-trailed accountability record.
A paper trail.
So while the Strobel leak might not force the Navy to break the blockade today, it violently tightens the clock on the administration's ability to wage this coercive campaign indefinitely. Because there is an ultimate, inescapable, hard-coded constraint facing the United States in this conflict.
And that brings us to the core of the timeline issue. We're talking about asymmetric clocks and the unforgiving reality of the 22nd Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Because while the president has the power to fire 4-star generals and ignore the entire CIA, there is one thing he absolutely cannot fire, and that is the calendar on the wall.
Time is the ultimate exogenous constraint in this entire strategic model. It is the one variable the administration cannot manipulate.
The CLG briefing lays out the math perfectly. As of the writing of this document on May 8th, 2026, there are exactly 990 days remaining until January 20, 2029.
Inauguration Day.
Inauguration Day.
Yeah.
The constitutionally mandated end of the current presidential term. And the briefing makes it explicitly, undeniably clear, despite whatever political rhetoric might be floating around, a third term is a political and constitutional impossibility.
The 22nd Amendment is a hard, impenetrable wall. And the analysts don't just state this as an opinion. They cite top Republican leadership to confirm that this isn't just some theoretical academic constraint. It is a practical, universally recognized reality accepted by the president's own party apparatus.
The quotes in the briefing are definitive. You have Representative Tom Cole, the incredibly influential House Rules Committee chair, publicly calling the idea of a third-term workaround too fanciful to really discuss seriously. You have Speaker of the House Mike Johnson completely dismissing the president's public remarks about a third term, waving them off as just being tongue-in-cheek. And then you have Majority Leader John Thune confirming that any legal workaround would require a full constitutional amendment, which is completely, fundamentally, politically unavailable in the current polarized climate.
So the U.S. strategy is operating inside a highly pressurized, rapidly shrinking box, 990 days. That is a fixed terminal node.
The clock is ticking down loudly.
Yeah, everybody on the global stage can clearly see the timer. And here is where the profound asymmetry of this conflict really takes center stage. Because while the United States is desperately playing a game of beat the clock, Iran is playing an entirely different game altogether.
Yeah, they have a completely different playbook.
They are operating on a strategic framework that the briefing refers to as the outlast doctrine.
And the Iranian leadership isn't foolish. They aren't blind to the intricacies of American domestic politics. They read the polls. They understand the 22nd Amendment just as intimately as the operatives in Washington do. And they have explicitly, overtly built their grand strategy around this 990-day countdown.
They recognize that they don't have to defeat the U.S. Navy. They just had to outlive the political mandate of the current administration.
The briefing cites an intel brief from the Sufan Center, which is a highly respected intelligence consultancy, and the title of their brief is incredibly telling. It's called Iran Open to Talks, but Plans to Outlast U.S. Blockade.
It's right there in the title.
Furthermore, the briefing notes that a senior U.S. official literally admitted to the Washington Post that the Iranian leadership has grown increasingly confident they can outlast U.S. political will. But you don't even need to rely on U.S. officials interpreting their intent. The most chilling, unambiguous confirmation comes directly from Iran's own supreme leadership. Let's look at the rhetoric of Mojtaba Khamenei,
who assumed the role of supreme leader following the highly disruptive decapitation strike that killed Ali Khamenei earlier in 2026.
Right. The U.S. literally killed the head of state, and yet the apparatus survives. And Mojtaba's very first public message as supreme leader on March 12th was not a plea for mercy. It was a strict tactical instruction to the military and the state.
What did he say?
He publicly declared that, quote, the lever of blocking the Strait of Hormuz must definitely continue to be used. He went on to announce that studies are underway regarding the opening of other fronts in which the enemy has little experience. He isn't signaling a desire to negotiate an exit. He's basically telling his entire country, dig in, we are holding the line, we will absorb the pain.
And you see this exact same defiance echoed uniformly across their entire governmental structure. The parliament speaker, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, delivered a fiery speech where he publicly dismissed the ongoing peace negotiations, Islamabad talks, which the U.S. was hoping would provide an off-ramp.
And what did he call it?
Ghalibaf called it negotiating under the table of surrender.
The table of surrender. In the context of Middle Eastern diplomacy, that is incredibly heavy, loaded rhetoric.
It is incredibly loaded because it intentionally invokes the deepest, most traumatic historical memories of the revolutionary regime. By explicitly calling it the table of surrender, Ghalibaf is consciously, deliberately echoing Ayatollah Khomeini's legendary speech from July 1988.
Oh, wow. The end of the Iran-Iraq War.
Yes. That was the moment when Khomeini finally accepted the UN resolution that ended that agonizing, incredibly brutal 8-year war. And Khomeini famously told his people that accepting that ceasefire was more deadly to him than drinking a chalice of poison.
Wow.
By invoking that specific level of historical existential sacrifice today, the current leadership is clearly signaling to their domestic base that giving in to the U.S. blockade right now would be a fundamental betrayal of the revolution itself. They are committing ideologically and structurally to extreme strategic patience.
So what does this all mean for the reality of the standoff? We have one side, the United States, desperately trying to force a definitive military or diplomatic conclusion before their 990-day electoral timer hits absolute zero.
Right.
And we have the other side, Iran, viewing any form of capitulation as a literal betrayal of their very existence and therefore willing to suffer virtually whatever economic or physical pain it takes just to run that clock out.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the U.S.-Iran conflict is no longer just a traditional military standoff where one side shoots until the other side breaks. It is fundamentally structurally a game of asymmetric clocks.
Asymmetric clocks, I like that.
The U.S. clock is rigid, fixed by law, highly public, and relentlessly counting down. Iran's clock is entirely fluid. It is not tied to a 4-year election cycle. Their clock is measured solely in institutional survival. They do not need to win a war in any conventional sense. They just need to survive until the morning of January 20, 2029.
But I have to stop and push back on this because it sounds almost too neat on paper. I understand the rhetoric of survival, but is relying purely on hunkering down an actual mathematically viable strategy against the full, unbridled might of the United States military and the global financial system?
It's a fair question.
I mean, we aren't talking about a minor trade dispute. We are talking about the most comprehensive sanctions regime in human history paired with a massive multi-carrier naval blockade. Can a regime really just grit its teeth and survive that kind of pressure for 3 entire years?
That is the multi-trillion-dollar question sitting at the center of the Pentagon right now. And to answer it objectively, the CLG analysts don't rely on predictive guessing. They look backward, deeply into the historical base rates of regime survival under exactly these specific conditions.
And when you dive into the data on the base rate of survival, it is honestly profoundly damning regarding the efficacy of this entire U.S. strategy.
It forces policymakers to look at the cold, hard, unforgiving statistics of coercion. The briefing outlines the historical track record for deeply entrenched adversarial regimes that have faced comprehensive U.S. sanctions combined with punitive air power, but crucially, without a full-scale, boots on the ground U.S. invasion.
Right. The without invasion part is key.
And the historical survival rate for those regimes facing those exact conditions is nearly 100%.
I want to really unpack this because the examples they provide paint a brutally clear picture of how hard it is to actually break a government from the outside. Let's look at Fidel Castro. He personally survived the aggressive foreign policy of 10 different U.S. presidents. The Castro regime as a continuous political entity has now survived 13 U.S. administrations, countless embargoes, and numerous CIA plots.
Look at the Kim dynasty in North Korea. They have survived 15 separate U.S. administrations, counting all the way back to Truman. Sanctions haven't stopped them, they've simply calcified the regime's control.
What about Saddam Hussein? He survived 12 years of absolutely crushing UN sanctions following the Gulf War. He survived 2 internationally enforced no-fly zones and massive sustained bombing campaigns like Operation Desert Fox in 1998. He only finally fell from power when the U.S. abandoned sanctions entirely and committed to a massive full-scale ground invasion in 2003.
It took troops on the ground.
Let's look closer to home, Venezuela. Nicolas Maduro survived 13 years of escalating, crippling economic sanctions stretching across 4 separate U.S. administrations. He watched his country's economy literally collapse into hyperinflation, and he didn't budge.
No, he didn't.
He only fell from power in January 2026, and as the briefing notes, that was only because of Operation Absolute Resolve, a highly specific, direct, kinetic U.S. raid on his military base in Caracas that physically captured him. Economic pressure didn't do it, a tactical strike team did.
And then look at Bashar al-Assad in Syria. He survived for well over a decade against an incredibly brutal internal civil war, massive Western sanctions, and international isolation. He finally fell in December 2024, but the CLG analysts make a crucial distinction here.
Which is?
His fall required a highly specific, totally unreplicable set of circumstances. It required the simultaneous collapse of Iran's regional proxy axis, Hezbollah's combat power being severely degraded by Israel, and Russia being entirely too consumed by the war in Ukraine to send military support.
A perfect storm.
Exactly. That specific multi-layered event tree of multiple patron collapses is simply not present for Iran right now.
And then, of course, there is Iran's own staggering resume of resilience. The briefing actively calls it out. As of May 2026, this specific revolutionary regime has successfully survived for 47 years. They have outlasted 9 U.S. administrations. They survived the horrifying meat grinder reality of the 8-year Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s.
They survived Stuxnet.
Yeah, they survived the highly sophisticated Stuxnet cyber attack that physically destroyed their nuclear centrifuges. They survived the comprehensive, globally coordinated Obama-era sanctions. They survived the shock of the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. They survived the massive nationwide Masa Amini domestic protests that many thought would be a breaking point. They even survived the June 2025 Israeli-U.S. nuclear strikes on their facilities and the decapitation strike that literally killed Ali Khamenei in February 2026.
They possess a 47-year battle-tested track record of absorbing catastrophic structural damage and somehow maintaining internal power. And the broader academic data entirely backs up how insanely difficult it is to break a regime constructed like this.
What does the data say?
The briefing cites the Feldbermer Global Sanctions Database from 2020, which is a massive data set. It puts the average success rate of all post-WWII economic sanctions at roughly 30% across all foreign policy goals.
Now, 30% doesn't sound fantastic, but it's not zero. You could argue it's worth trying if you have a 1 in 3 chance of success.
But that 30% includes minor goals, like getting a country to release a political prisoner or adjust a tariff. The briefing then cites Robert Pape's classic, rigorous reanalysis published in the journal International Security. When you filter the data and look specifically at successful coercion, meaning using economic sanctions to force a major structural policy change from a hostile, entrenched regime, the historical success rate plummets to approximately 5%.
5%.
5%.
You are basically rolling a 20-sided die and hoping for a critical hit.
And the data gets even worse for the blockader. The correlation between how long the sanctions last and how effective they are is sharply negative, meaning multi-year comprehensive sanctions almost never dislodge deeply ideologically committed regimes, especially if those regimes have major power patrons quietly backing them up on the global stage.
It makes me think of trying to clear out a deeply rooted, highly invasive weed in your garden. If you just go out there and aggressively trim all the visible leaves and maybe put a heavy tarp over it to deprive it of sunlight for a few days, you aren't actually killing the weed.
No, you're not.
The root system is still entirely intact.
Yeah.
What you are actually doing is triggering its biological survival mechanism. It realizes it's under attack, so it forces its roots even deeper into the ground to find resources. That's what this specific U.S. strategy seems to do to regimes like Iran. It doesn't break them, it triggers a massive rally around the flag survival effect.
That is an incredibly apt, biologically sound analogy. The briefing actually references a piece from Foreign Affairs by an analyst named Danny Citrinovich, and the title of his essay is perfectly aligned with your weed analogy.
Oh, finally.
It's called How the War Saved the Iranian Regime. External pressure paradoxically acts as a unifying force. It preserves the internal cohesion of the regime's vast security apparatus. Iran still has the IRGC. They still have millions of besieged paramilitaries ready to deploy internally. And crucially, they still have major patrons in Russia and China ensuring they don't completely starve. None of the actual physical preconditions for a regime collapse, such as a full grounds invasion, the physical capture of the capital city, or the total abandonment by superpower backing, are on the table right now.
Okay, so if we establish through the historical data that Iran is statistically, historically, and structurally highly unlikely to just fold under this external pressure, the natural immediate next question is how long can the U.S. actually sustain this pressure? Because from a purely logistical standpoint, maintaining a naval blockade halfway across the world cannot be cheap and it cannot be easy on the military.
This is exactly where the theoretical strategy crashes headfirst into the physical reality of military logistics and domestic American political stamina.
The briefing details the absolutely massive, almost unfathomable resources required to maintain what the administration is publicly branding as the wall of steel blockade.
Yeah.
Right now, this single localized operation in the Middle East is actively consuming roughly 41% of all forward deployed U.S. Navy combatants.
The number is just...
Let that sink in for a second. 41%. Almost half of America's active, globally deployed naval power is sitting in and around the Strait of Hormuz.
The physical hardware requirements and the resulting human toll on the sailors are staggering. We are talking about tying down 3 complete carrier strike groups. And a carrier strike group isn't just one ship.
Right, it's a whole fleet.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's the nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, the air wing of dozens of jets, the accompanying guided missile cruisers, squadrons of destroyers, attack submarines, and the massive logistical supply ships needed to keep them fueled and fed. Right now, they have the USS Abraham Lincoln, the USS George H.W. Bush, and until very recently, the USS Gerald R. Ford, all tied to this one mission.
Yeah, the Ford.
In fact, the briefing highlights that the Ford just transited the Suez Canal heading home after enduring a 296-day deployment.
296 days at sea. I can't even imagine. That is the longest post-Vietnam carrier deployment on the historical record. That kind of operational tempo is utterly exhausting. It burns out the complex machinery, it delays critical nuclear maintenance cycles, and it absolutely decimates the morale and retention of the sailors.
It's unsustainable.
Alongside those massive carriers, you have more than a dozen Arleigh Burke-class destroyers running constant patrols, 2 full amphibious-ready groups, and roughly 16,500 sailors and Marines actively deployed in this specific theater. And here's the real kicker, the detail that makes this operation so fragile. The U.S. is doing this entirely alone. This is a massive operation, but it is a coalition of one.
Which is incredibly rare in modern military history. Contrast this unilateral, isolated action with how historical blockades were successfully run. When the U.S. enforced the Iraq Maritime Interception Operation in the 1990s, yes, it lasted for 13 years, but it had the explicit legal backing of the United Nations Security Council, and it relied on a massive multinational maritime coalition to share the financial and operational burden.
Look at the Cuban Missile Crisis quarantine back in the 60s. That was intense, unilateral action, but it only lasted 28 days. The naval blockade of Wonsan during the Korean War lasted a very long time, but it ended in a negotiated armistice. Here, in 2026, the U.S. is attempting to unilaterally sustain a grueling 990-day operation with 0 major allies participating.
None.
The briefing explicitly notes that the traditional American allies, the UK, France, Germany, Japan, South Korea, Australia, all of them have actively, publicly declined to participate in this wall of steel.
They look at the extreme volatility of the region, they calculate the enormous financial cost, and they have actively opted out. And that stark international isolation is rapidly compounding the severe domestic political deterioration back in the United States. A blockade is never just a test of the blockaded nation's economy. It is fundamentally a test of the blockader's domestic political stamina.
And according to the data in this briefing, the U.S. stamina is actively failing. Let's look at the domestic polling numbers provided by the analysts. U.S. public opposition to sending actual ground troops into Iran is sitting at 74%. Opposition to a full, large-scale invasion is at a massive bipartisan 93%.
The public does not want it.
The American public has absolutely zero appetite for a war. Meanwhile, everyday Americans are feeling the economic blowback. They are paying $4.48 a gallon for gas, and a staggering 63% of them are blaming the president personally for that pain at the pump.
And as a direct consequence of that economic pain and war fatigue, the president's overall approval rating is currently hovering in the mid to high 30s across multiple major polling averages.
And then there's the looming legislative threat. The briefing cites prediction markets, specifically Polymarket, which is currently forecasting an 84% probability that the Democratic Party will take decisive control of the House of Representatives following the midterm elections, seating them in January 2027.
That changes everything.
If that happens, and Representative Hakeem Jeffries ascends to become Speaker of the House, the dynamic shifts entirely. He will immediately possess subpoena power to investigate the origins of the intelligence failures, and much more importantly, he will hold absolute appropriations leverage, the power of the purse.
Which is the fatal flaw in the 990-day strategy. If a hostile anti-war Congress takes the purse strings, it effectively cuts the president's operational timeline down from 990 days to just 630 days. Because a Congress that's swept into power on an anti-war mandate will simply refuse to pass the funding bills required to keep fueling the wall of steel.
Wait, so let me make sure I'm synthesizing this correctly. Even if the Pentagon could physically manage to keep these ships out there, continuously burning out crews, ignoring maintenance schedules, and degrading hardware for a full 990 days, the political and financial realities back home in Washington might force Congress to pull the plug long before that timeline ever runs out.
Precisely. The United States is rapidly hitting both a physical operational ceiling and a hard domestic political ceiling. They simply cannot sustain this massive level of unilateral power projection indefinitely without causing severe institutional and political fracture at home.
Okay, so if the U.S. is facing this impending, unavoidable ceiling, what does the reality look like on the ground inside Iran? Because if the leaked CIA assessment says they have a 90 to 120-day window of guaranteed survival, can their economy actually absorb the shock of this blockade for that long, or potentially even longer?
To understand their resilience, we have to deeply analyze the collision between the U.S. economic weapons and Iran's structural defenses.
The analysts acknowledge the very real, very severe economic damage that the U.S. sanctions, which the administration aggressively branded as Operation Economic Fury, have inflicted on the Iranian populace.
And the damage to the civilian economy is undeniably devastating.
The statistics are grim. The briefing notes that the Iranian rial is currently trading at an abysmal 1.78 million to the U.S. dollar on the parallel black market. The cost of basic sustenance has skyrocketed. Food inflation is sitting at a historical, crushing record of 99% year over year.
Wow.
And their primary engine of national income, their maritime oil exports, have violently collapsed from roughly 1.84 million barrels per day down to under 600,000 barrels per day. But I have to push back here, because if I'm looking at a country where food costs double every year and their main export drops by 2/3, how is that not the definition of a total systemic collapse?
Because you were looking at the civilian pain, not the state's structural buffers. On paper, to a Western economist, it looks like an economy in terminal freefall. It looks exactly like a system that should violently fracture from within during the CIA's 90 to 120-day window. But the CLG analysts point to critical, deeply embedded counter-evidence that extends Iran's survival runway far beyond that assumed breaking point.
They've built a massive, multi-layered absorptive cushion. First, let's talk about the physical oil they have managed to stockpile. The U.S. Navy can block ships from leaving port, but they can't erase the oil that's already pumped.
Right, it's already out of the ground.
The briefing cites advanced satellite tracking data showing that Iran has somewhere between 170 to 200 million barrels of crude oil just sitting, floating on the water in massive anchored supertankers, plus another 35 million barrels safely tucked away in underground storage facilities inside the Persian Gulf.
That massive volume of floating storage acts as a vital, highly liquid buffer against the immediate collapse of state revenue. When they desperately need cash, they engage in highly complex, illicit ship-to-ship transfers at night, spoofing their tracking beacons to move that stored oil into the black market. But they also have physical, geographic workarounds that a Navy simply cannot touch. The U.S. blockade is entirely maritime, but Iran is a massive country that shares multiple porous land borders. The briefing highlights a rapidly expanding rail corridor running north through Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan. This overland route can move up to 300,000 barrels per day of refined petroleum products directly into eager markets in Turkey, Pakistan, and deeper into Central Asia.
Right, so a train line through Turkmenistan obviously doesn't completely replace the massive volume of dozens of supertankers, but that's not the goal. The goal isn't prosperity, it's survival. That overland cash flow is enough to keep the military paid and the lights on in Tehran. But the real ultimate lifeline here isn't just clever smuggling, it comes directly from their major power patrons on the UN Security Council. We have to talk about Russia and China.
Because without them, the U.S. strategy might actually work. Russia officially signed a comprehensive strategic partnership treaty with Iran in October of 2025. Now, it is important to note that it's not a mutual defense pact. Russia isn't obligated to go to war for Iran, but it absolutely guarantees deep economic, technological, and strategic cooperation.
And diplomatic cover, too.
Yes. Russia actively wielded its veto power at the UN to kill any international resolutions against Iran. But much more concretely, Russia is providing vital, advanced military hardware. We are seeing active deliveries of Mi-28 attack helicopters, and highly advanced Su-35 fighter jets are scheduled for delivery right through 2026 and 2028. And perhaps most dangerously for the U.S. Navy, Russian intelligence is reportedly providing highly classified satellite-derived targeting data to help Iranian missile batteries track the movements of U.S. warships in real time.
That is a game changer. And what about China's role in this ecosystem? Because they are the economic engine of this whole anti-hegemonic bloc.
China operates much more quietly, but they act as the ultimate buyer of last resort. Even under the threat of immense U.S. secondary sanctions, the Chinese economy is quietly absorbing the vast bulk of Iran's illicit shadow fleet oil exports, effectively injecting billions of dollars of hard currency into the Iranian central bank when they need it most.
So when we synthesize all these disparate details, the millions of barrels of floating oil, the smuggling trains running through Central Asia, the influx of Russian attack helicopters, and the constant flow of Chinese cash, what does that actually tell us about the CIA's leaked 90 to 120-day timeline?
It tells us that the 90 to 120-day window is not a literal countdown timer to a fall of Tehran moment. It is merely a severe structural stress test. And Iran has spent 4 decades explicitly provisioning itself to pass exactly this kind of test.
Right, yeah.
What is absolutely crucial for Western observers to understand is that Iran's military endurance is intentionally, structurally decoupled from its immediate domestic economic pain.
That's a huge point.
The grim reality that civilian food inflation is at 99% does not change the hard military fact that the IRGC still possesses 75% of their mobile missile launchers hidden deep in mountain bunkers. Their offensive military capability is actively regenerating through Russian supply lines, not depleting, even as the broader civilian economy suffers terribly.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me, because despite all this incredibly visible data, despite the undeniable math showing that Iran has the cushions to survive while the U.S. is rapidly hitting a political and logistical ceiling, the global prediction markets, where highly informed people are betting millions of dollars of real money on these outcomes, are currently pricing in completely different scenarios. Let's dive into how the financial world is viewing this.
The CLG briefing does a brilliant, fascinating job of contrasting the so-called wisdom of the crowds found on major betting platforms like Polymarket and Kalshi against their own rigorous structural estimates for what the world will look like on January 20, 2029. And the divergences between the gamblers and the analysts are incredibly stark.
Let's actually run through this data deep dive, comparing the market's optimistic bets against the CLG model's sober reality. First question. Will Iran ultimately retain its southern uranium enrichment capability?
The prediction market currently says there's only a 56% chance they keep it.
Right, but the CLG model, looking at the structural reality, says it's a massive 88% probability. Next question. Will the wall of steel blockade of the Strait of Hormuz still be in effect by January 2029?
The market thinks the U.S. will hold the line. They price it as highly likely at 74%.
And the CLG model looks at the naval burnout and says there's only a 15% chance the U.S. can sustain the operation that long. Third scenario. Will a comprehensive peace deal actually be signed before the president leaves office?
The market is highly optimistic, pricing a peace deal at 74%.
While the CLG model is deeply pessimistic, giving it just a 42% chance. And finally, the nightmare scenario. Will the U.S. launch a full ground invasion?
The market gives it a concerning 21% chance.
CLG says it's extremely unlikely at only 9%.
This raises an important fundamental question about human psychology and financial forecasting. Why are the highly capitalized financial markets so seemingly wrong? Why are investors betting millions on outcomes that the structural military realities suggest are highly improbable?
Yeah, if the data regarding naval burnout and Iranian resilience is so clear, why are the Wall Street gamblers betting against the CIA's structural data? Are they seeing something the analysts are missing?
No, they aren't seeing better data. They are simply pricing the wrong incentive structure. The markets are obsessively looking at the U.S. administration's desperate, ticking 990-day electoral clock.
They see the polls.
Exactly. They see the cratering poll numbers, and they are actively pricing in the U.S. principal's overwhelming political need for an exit ramp. They assume that because the U.S. president desperately needs a signed peace deal to save his political legacy and his party's future, a peace deal will miraculously materialize.
I see. It's exactly like a negotiation where one person is absolutely desperate to buy a car today because they have to commute to a new job tomorrow. The seller of the car, however, knows they don't actually have to sell the vehicle for another 3 years, and if they simply wait, the vintage market will give them double the price. The prediction market is betting that the desperate buyer's sheer, undeniable need will somehow force a deal into existence today. But the cold math, the CLG model, points out that the patient seller has absolutely no structural reason to capitulate to a low-ball offer. They will just smile politely, refuse to hand over the keys, and walk away from the table.
Exactly. The financial market is incorrectly pricing the principal's revealed, highly public exit incentive, rather than evaluating the counterparty's structural incentive to accept the offered terms. Iran has absolutely zero rational reason to sign a humiliating peace deal that permanently strips them of their nuclear enrichment capabilities when they know mathematically that the U.S. naval blockade is highly likely to collapse under its own domestic political weight well before those 990 days are up.
Which brings us nicely to our synthesis, the overall takeaway of this deep dive. When we step back from the individual data points and look at the totality of this dense CLG briefing, the core thesis of the document is inescapable. This entire terrifying geopolitical crisis is fundamentally a game of asymmetric lambda operating on asymmetric clocks.
That is the perfect distillation of the geopolitical reality. On one side of the globe, you have a U.S. administration that has actively, systematically purged its most reliable, experienced military and intelligence voices. They have voluntarily driven their internal lambda down to zero.
Right.
Because of that self-imposed blindness, they cannot accurately gauge the physical reality of their adversary's strength, and so they are attempting to force a military capitulation against a hard 990-day constitutionally mandated political deadline.
And on the other side of the globe, you have the Iranian revolutionary regime, a regime that has been forged and tempered by half a century of surviving brutal blockades, targeted assassinations, and catastrophic regional wars. Their internal lambda is finely tuned to their own historical resilience. They believe their own survival data.
Because they've lived it.
Yeah, they aren't worried about an upcoming midterm election or a drop in approval ratings. They are perfectly structurally calibrated to absorb the massive economic pain, keep their rapidly regenerating missile hardware safely tucked away in underground bunkers, and simply patiently wait the United States out.
And because of that massive structural and temporal asymmetry, the CLG briefing offers a highly specific, highly confident verdict for the modal outcome, meaning the single most mathematically likely scenario when we finally reach Inauguration Day on January 20, 2029.
And based on everything we've unpacked today, that outcome is certainly not going to be a U.S. victory parade down Pennsylvania Avenue.
No, it is not. The sober assessment of the analysts is that on Inauguration Day 2029, the revolutionary regime will comfortably remain in absolute power in Tehran. They will successfully retain their residual nuclear enrichment capabilities. And ultimately, in a bitter twist of geopolitical irony, it will be the United States that makes the painful concessions, likely agreeing to a significantly relaxed international sanctions architecture, simply to end a naval blockade they can no longer financially or politically afford to maintain.
The party with the credible, demonstrated commitment to wait ultimately holds the equilibrium. They hold the real power in the negotiation.
Before we wrap up, I want to leave our listener with a final thought to ponder, something that builds on the implications of this entire briefing, but stretches far beyond the Middle East.
What's that?
Well, if a regional power armed with a deeply entrenched ideological structure and major power backing, can successfully utilize a strategy of simply waiting out a global superpower's rigid electoral cycle. What does that mean for the entire concept of global deterrence moving forward? If time itself can be so effectively weaponized against the structural constraints of a democracy, who really holds the ultimate strategic advantage in the conflicts of the 21st century?
Wow. It's a genuinely chilling question to walk away with. If the foundation of your global deterrence is just a fresh coat of political paint layered over a 990-day structural sinkhole, eventually the ground is going to give way. Thank you so much for joining us on this intense deep dive into the CLG intelligence briefing. We know it was a dense and heavy topic today, but the absolute best way to not feel overwhelmed by the constant flood of daily conflicting information is to look past the political noise, find the hard structural realities beneath, and measure the depth of the sinkhole for yourself. See you next time.
Tune in next time on The Valley Current.